Tēnā koutou katoa, kamihana kia koutou. Very warm greetings on a freezing night. Welcome to Te Whare Wānanga o Waitaha, the University of Canterbury. And warm greetings not only to the many people who have turned out on such a cold night, but to the many more who are online joining us. If you're online, I hope you're by a fire or somewhere warm. But certainly the topic will warm us up. I'm Bronwyn Hayward from Political Science, and I've just got to speak on behalf of the University for a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our keynote speaker. Everyone in Canterbury knows the drill, but in the unlikely event there's an earthquake, we just stay where we are, and then when the shaking stops, our lovely people in red from the University of Canterbury will be directing us out to the assembly area to my right. There are also toilets just in the foyer. If you need them, just slip out. And Professor Ratuva will be taking questions at the end. And we'll just ask you to use the microphone because this is being recorded. So it's a topic I never expected to be introducing, Bullshitology speaking, but it is a great privilege to introduce our colleague and Pro-Vice-Chancellor Pacific, Fijian-born Distinguished Professor Stephen Ratuva, who's the Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies, as well as being Pro-Vice-Chancellor, but that's not all he does. He's also a member of the Climate Commission. He's also a member of the Royal Society's Council. He's also the chair of the International Political Science Association. He's also the chair of the Research Committee on Climate Security and Planetary Politics. He's been a Fulbright and Senior Fellow to the University of California and to Duke University and Georgetown University. His own PhD came from the UK in development studies at the University of Sussex, and he's led a number of international projects and networks. And he's a prolific writer. He was awarded the University of Canterbury's Research Medal in 2019, and soon after the Royal Society's Metternich Medal for Social Science Research Excellence. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society and a global interdisciplinary scholar. He's a specialist in anthropology, political science, post-colonial studies, Indigenous studies, development, and history. He's carried out research in Asia, Europe, Africa, the Pacific, New Zealand, and the United States. It is a great pleasure to introduce him. He said to skip a lot of the bit in the middle, but I would just add, because I've just learnt, that I don't know when he does this, because I actually don't know how much seriously Steve fits in his life. But outside of all this, he plays the keyboard and sings, and he's an artist, and he draws cartoons, which I did know because they're sometimes on his office door, but he's also published them for numerous magazines. His favourite rugby team, he says, is Jura, but he switches to the Crusaders when Jura loses. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Distinguished Professor Stephen Ratuva.
Where have my notes gone? Oh, you've taken them. Oh. But they had legs. They move around. Sorry about that. I've been having this a bit of cold for the last few days because of the weather. So sorry for the weather. Sorry for the bit of hail when I was coming in. It's not my fault. Someone has to be blamed. Now, tēnā tatau, tēnā katou katoa, tuatahi, nā mihi nui ki nai tahu, nā mihi nui ki nai hurio, tēnei whenua, tēnā katou katoa, nisambulu venaka, na marama, turanke na marama. It's so nice to be here tonight, so nice to see all of you. Something like 310 or 15 are registered. And of course, because of the weather, some people are online. And one of the reasons why I said yes to give the lecture was because I had no choice. Now, when I was asked to give the lecture some time ago, I was thinking, what else is left to talk about? I've been giving a series of lectures, international ones, online and in person, in the last few months. And I thought I would probably try to take away the bottom of academia and something which is too formalistic, something which makes you think, and talk about something which will make you perhaps laugh a little bit and relax a little bit, something which we all are familiar with, something we all engage with, and that is the theme of bullshit. Now, it may sound like a word, a rhetorical term that we use every day, a colloquial term, but over the years it has become a serious academic discourse among some of the scholars. It's not so. In the last 10 years or so, what we've seen is the birth of this thing called bullshitology. Now, and of course, central to bullshitology is the study of bullshit. It's not so much a discipline as such, because it's very interdisciplinary, as we'll see later. Philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, and management experts have joined in this new embracing of these new ideas about this thing called bullshit. Now, what I'll be talking about today, basically in three parts. One is the global scenario which has led to the rise of this thing called bullshitology. And secondly, I'll be briefly looking at some of the ways in which bullshitologists have expressed, have articulated their thoughts, their theories, their philosophies, their sociological framing of it. And thirdly, is to look at the future. What does the future like in terms of knowledge in the context of bullshitology? Now, it's the last few months, in fact, last couple of years, I've been involved in some of the lectures, public lectures. I think one of the biggest ones was I was asked by the Paul Grave Springer, the biggest publisher, academic publisher in the world, to give the 2022 annual global lecture. And the theme was on the crisis of the global crisis and the role of social science and humanities. And one of the messages which I shared was the disconnection between the global crisis, the realities of the world, and a lot of the research which is done in social science and humanities. In fact, social science and humanities have shifted away from its original focus and intention on expanding the horizon of knowledge into creation of metrics, creation of quantified, algorithmic, standardized knowledge for the purpose of institutional recording rather than, and of course, for universities' ranking, rather than for the advancement of knowledge and humanity. Now, and there are a few things which I want to share with you today, which are linked to that discussion, and of course, bringing in some of the work which is done by other scholars. Now, what about the world around us? What has happened in the last few years? A number of things have been happening. One was we see the mismatch between what we experience every day, what we hear, and what we're made to feel. And in fact, so much of what we know is constructed by others. And the feeling of alienation and the feeling of anxiety about things around us in the media, for instance, or in politics, or in the social world, has become part of our own sense of anxiety and curiosity about what's happening around us. And the expansion of the fake news ecosystem with Trump, of course, and the conspiracy theories, whether it's to do with COVID, to do with climate change, a whole lot of issues, and the emergence of the fake news has distorted the way we see the world. The line between what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is truth, and what is not has become much more fluid as a result of the way in which our own minds and the way in which we try to capture our knowledge around us has changed quite a lot. One of the leading journalists in America called Evan Davis, who's done a lot of work in terms of, he's interviewed CEOs and politicians in the United States, including the presidents of the United States, wrote a book about whether we have reached big bullshit. Then he argued that, yes, indeed, a lot of his work was basically to do with capturing this thing he calls bullshit, and then putting them on television, on radio. John Lovett, a former speechwriter to Obama and Hillary Clinton, made a commencement address to graduating students in a college in Southern California. And the topic of his speech was bullshit. And he talked about the fact that so much of his work revolved around it. Writing speeches for politicians has to do with not so much telling the truth, but framing the narratives so that the president will look good, so that the public will see what he wants the public to see, so that the imagery is sophisticated. It's to do with getting elected once more. It has to do with the image, not only within America, but globally. And then from his experience, so much of what he was doing was actually bullshit work. But we'll talk about that later in more detail. Now, and of course, over the years, the power of institutions to control people's mind through processes of what an anthropologist called Chris Shaw referred to as the audit culture. The audit culture, which started off in the military in the United States and then became part of the corporate and the government and university and almost every institution now go through the auditing process. People are audited, work is audited, and everything is reduced into metrics. So his argument is that through the audit culture, human beings are reduced into basic entities which no longer have any consciousness, but rather, and human agency is taken away. And as a result, what we have is a total control of institutions, of people's lives. Now, and then you have the cultural dominance and ideological control over people's lives. A French sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, some of you may have heard of him. He became one of the most highly quoted social scientists in the world, one of the very famous critical sociologists. He talked about this thing called cultural arbitrary. It was taken from French and translated into English. He wrote in French all the time, and thus the rather awkward sounding cultural arbitrary. So his argument is that institutions, the way and states and powerful forces in society and the way they control culture and our thoughts are being strengthened by what he calls the concealment of those very forces. In other words, you control them, then you conceal, make sure that nobody knows what's happening. And that's where the power lies, so that people can remain ignorant. In some ways, that line of argument was taken up by, some of you may have heard of Noam Chomsky, who is actually one of the, perhaps the most famous of social scientists in the 20th, 21st century. He's written almost 100 books here. And he talked about two levels of narratives. One is the public justificatory narrative, something which the state or those in power want us to hear. And then this, another level of narrative, something which they don't want you to hear, and that is what he refers to as the technical narrative. So one of the examples he gave was to do with the Vietnam War. For instance, he writes about geopolitical interests of the United States globally, that the government or the US would want, like the war in Vietnam has to do with freedom, has to do with liberation, when in fact that is the public outer narrative. And the hidden narrative, which is the technical narrative, it more has to do with the increase of U.S. corporate influence in Southeast Asia. Now, and of course, the war in Iraq The outer narrative has to do with weapons of mass destruction. But the technical narrative, according to him, would be, we just want to have access to the oil anyway, at the end of the day, because the people who started the war are oil, people, the bush and so forth. So in other words, they didn't actually use the word bullshit, but they were talking about in a very, very respectable way, academically respectable way, that there are levels which are basically lies, of narrative which are lies, which are covered up by the public narrative that we have to hear, that we have to consume on a daily basis. Now, and then Evan Waters talked about the book Crazy Like Us, which talks about the way in which the person is American, the Americanization of our thinking, of our minds. Every time we're thirsty, we drink Coca-Cola. Every time we want to wear something, it's a Nike. And turn on the radio, it's a hip hop. The Americanization of the world means that our own culture is subsumed to this dominant thinking. And then in the context of bullshit theory, is the fact that, well, the so-called American bullshit, which some people refer to, some others refer to the term American bullshit. Now, and over the years, what we've also seen is the anti-colonial movement around the world, and the way in which the term colonial bullshit has become a dominant part of the driving force, to deconstruct some of the dominant ideas of the colonial order. Now, and in relation to that, is what we've seen in the last few years is the power of algorithms, the power of the AI, artificial intelligence, which has determined the way in which we see the world and the way in which our own intelligence is being articulated. And some are beginning to use the term, the algorithmic, the digital bullshit as a way in which our own minds are being controlled and our own behavior are being channeled in a particular direction. Now, so scholars have begun to question the value of knowledge itself, particularly in the last few years where, the last 40, 50 years, where knowledge is no longer what you're brought up to believe it is, to transform our own understanding of the world, but rather it has become a commodity to be bought and sold in the market. That universities are no longer the great creators of intelligence, but rather a marketplace to buy and sell knowledge. So if you can't generate money through students and through your grants, what happens? You lose your job. It's happening all around, as you can see, the world, not only New Zealand. So the commodification of knowledge has led some to come up with a term, academic bullshit. We'll talk about that later. A number of authors have wrote about that, in the way in which the trivialization of what we know through the market demand has changed fundamentally the configuration and the contours of understanding and of knowledge systems around the world. Now, and then at the same time, this diminishing sense of self-worth in authorities, in bureaucracies, and in institutions. I'll talk about Andrew Spicer later. We'll talk about organizational bullshit. He's actually, British. He works in Britain, he's a professor in Britain, but he was born in New Zealand. He's a Kiwi himself. He'll talk about the way in which organizations, corporate organizations in particular, have designed what he refers to as organizational bullshit in terms of the norms, in terms of ideas, which have nothing to do with reality, but only to perpetuate not just the profit of some, but also the power and the influence of certain individuals within institutions. And then over the years as well, what we've seen is the growth of pseudoscience in the area of race relations. Chris Cunin argues that the idea of Aboriginal so-called barbarism and so forth, and uncivilized, and all these terms have been constructed over the years to cover up some of the injustices which have been imposed on Aborigines, for instance, in Australia and other places around the world. So, increasingly, people become, scholars in particular have become, begin to question a lot of things. With all these things happening around us, with the world changing so fast, with the idea of truth, with the idea of concealment, with the idea of falsification, with the ideas of multiple narratives, and then you sell certain narratives, and then you hide certain narratives. And then it causes not just confusion, but anxiety as well, a feeling of cynicism, and a feeling of alienation and powerlessness amongst a lot of people. So it is within this context that some scholars begin to identify a particular niche and say, let's call this, let's call it what it is, what these things are, and that is bullshit. And in the last 15 years or so, what we've seen is the growth of this thing called bullshitology, where scholars begin to study this thing called bullshit. Now, so when the term was first used, people were shaken. How do you use such a term? It's non-academic. It's the term that you use after the lecture. Oh, the professor was talking bullshit. It's a term that you use when nobody's listening. But now it's been brought to mainstream academia to become part of the way in which we frame ideas and we frame perceptions and behavior of people. Now Google Scholar itself lists something like 1,010 academic works with the word bullshit as the title. In other words, it has grown. In the last 2 years, since 2020, that's how many years? Three years. About 124 of them just emerged, and they're mushrooming all the time. And they have emerged in different disciplines, in literature, in political science, in sociology, in anthropology, in philosophy, and so forth. Now let's look at some of these, if you like, bullshitologies. So the term bullshitology thus emerged. It is being used to refer to those who have been studying bullshit. Now there's a difference between a bullshitologist and a bullshitter. A bullshitter is somebody who bullshits. A bullshitologist is somebody who studies bullshit. Now, perhaps one of the most significant ones was Harry Frankfurt, who was a professor of philosophy. He's an analytical philosopher. At Princeton University, one of America's leading university, he became one of the most, in fact, his work on bullshit, it's called, he put together a little book called On Bullshit. And in there, he argued that so far this hasn't been, we use the word bullshit, but there hasn't been any theory of bullshit to try and capture it neatly in an academic discourse. So he tried to draw the line between what he refers to as bullshit and lies, or bullshitter and a liar. So to him, a liar is somebody who deliberately distorts an idea or hides something so that you won't know about it. He or she knows that something is wrong, but tries to provide information to try and cover that up. So it's a diversionary technique. So we all lie since we can remember. Yeah, when you come back from school late, when you're a school kid, and your mother asks you, "Where have you been?" "Oh, I've been working with a teacher doing my assignment," when in fact you were in the city. So that, according to him, is a lie. But a bullshit is different. A bullshitter has no concern with whether what is being said is true or false. In fact, a lot of things which they believe in, things which they say, are probably not true, but that's not the purpose. For the bullshitter, it has to do with the purpose of bullshitting. Let's say, as an example, let's say a politician. When a politician lies, we ask the politician, did you steal $1 million from your constituency? No. Although the person did it. So that's a lie. But when the politician bullshits, it's nothing to do with right and wrong. The person will say something like, in my mind, I can save the world from doom. And if you vote for me, New Zealand will forever be thankful for my generosity and the great ideas that will make all of you become immensely prosperous for the rest of your lives. So in other words, there's nothing in there. All those things don't happen anyway. But it's not so much the content of what is being said, it is the purpose. The purpose is to make you vote for the person. The purpose is to make you feel good. The purpose is to make sure that the status of the speaker is being heightened and glorified as a result of those glorious words. So he distinguishes between a lie and a bullshit. So the bullshit can actually be, sometimes have some elements of truth, but the speaker himself or herself may not believe in those. It's to do with the purpose for which it is being said. Now, and then, his argument is that it's not so much a liar who is a threat to society, it is the bullshitter. Because what you do is that if you're a bullshitter, is that you mesmerize people's thinking and you cover up that you capture the ideas, then you steal their hearts. The lie doesn't do that. The lie simply lies and then walks off laughing and so forth. Now, and then he also argues that, okay, the way we see lying sometimes can be very religious. And he refers to St. Augustine. St. Augustine actually, his definition of lying is very much linked to the Ten Commandments, and has been used by the Catholic Church over the years as the basis on which they have theologized the idea of lying. So to him, the liars, they steer people's perception away from the truth. But the bullshitter has no disregard for truth anyway. Now, so, but when he published his work, there was an explosion. People became a big seller. The New York Times, it became a bestseller for a few months, in fact, for a few years. It appeared on the top television shows in the United States, such as the Daily Show with Jon Stewart. You remember him? A very funny guy. And he was a star. And one of the reasons why he was a star was because he was able to use a term which we all use every day and then elevated it into the status of an academic discourse. Now, after that, after Frankfurt, then came a whole wave of scholars studying bullshit and using his definition of bullshit as a way in which they tried to frame the kind of research that they were doing. Now, but there were criticisms as well of Frankfurt. For instance, some argue that he defined truth as being something which is very, very static, it's given, where in fact there are different versions of truth. And also some argue that perhaps the way he defined bullshit and lying and all these things and truth are pretty narrow and does not take into consideration the human agency, that people are very smart in terms of the way they frame their narratives, which might be not so much bullshit in terms of how Frankfurt sees it, but in different ways. So the different ways in which we may perceive a particular discourse and narrative and words. Now, one of the, I won't say students of Frankfurt, but one of those who drew from Frankfurt's definition of bullshit is Professor Andrew Spicer, I was telling you about. He's Kiwi, was born here. And then he's now a British scholar. So I suppose we should be proud of a Kiwi bullshitologist. Now, in this book, Playing the Bullshit Game, How Empty and Misleading Communication Takes Over Organizations. It does a critical examination of organizations. It does a critical examination of corporate institutions and the way in which he argues that they have been taken over by rhetoric, taken over by beautiful words, taken over by ideas which have nothing to do with reality. And they have hired a whole lot of, an army of consultants, of PR people, of people who are out to sell images. Images become more important than real things. And images of a product is more important than the real product. Like, for instance, when you're buying Coca-Cola, when Coca-Cola is being advertised, it's not so much that you are buying the Coca-Cola, because Coca-Cola is basically what? It's water and sugar and some chemicals which, if you analyze them, can be dangerous to you. That's not what you're buying. What you're buying is the image. When you're buying a car, it's not so much the car itself. The car can be a hopeless one, but what you're buying is the image of it. So the image has become the sellable commodity, not so much the product itself. And then you have an army of people who work in corporations and whose work is simply to do that. Now, and then he talks about not only corporations, educational, institutions like universities, of course. And then to him, bullshit is not just a rhetorical device. It is a social practice which has been institutionalized into corporations, into governments, into, universities. I hope I won't get sacked for that. I was just joking. And to the extent that you really cannot delineate anymore, that you cannot separate what kind of practices are actually making any impact and which ones are not, because of the image making focus, because of the ways in which narratives have taken over from practicalities. Now, and then around the same time, an American, but British as well, was working in Britain at the London School of Economics, an anthropologist by the name of David Graeber, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. He came up with a book which became a bestseller. Again, all the books, all those academic works which have followed along the lines of Bullshitology became bestsellers. Yeah, became bestsellers, primarily because of the way in which they appeal to people. So he wrote the book Bullshit Jobs, a theory, and he drew from Frankfurt. Then he said that a lot of the jobs that we have are actually meaningless to people, but they're meaningful to some, particularly those who benefit from those jobs, because the big bureaucracy creates positions which alienates a lot of people. And when you asked, in fact, they did a survey in Britain, something like 37% said that the work which they do actually are meaningless. They just work because they have to pay for the bills. And when you think about the value of the work, they said there's not much in there. So meaningless jobs, he says, actually leads to societal harm because it impacts on people. Increasingly, you see people getting traumatized and stressed as a result of the kind of work practices which happen. And then he argues that more than half of the work in society are actually pointless. And then he categorizes 5 types of pointless work. Now let me, or what he calls bullshit jobs. Now, these are not his ideas, because before he wrote his book, The Bullshit Jobs, he came up with a paper called Bullshit Jobs as well. The paper became, basically, it was so popular. And then people were making comments, and people were writing in, people with jobs were saying, haha, this is it. And then he collected all those responses from people and then put them together in the book. And then he then began to categorize those responses from people who say, yes, my job is bullshit, yes, my job bullshit, hundreds of them. And then he categorized them into 5 different categories. The first one is what he calls the flunkies, those who serve to make their superiors feel important. Example, receptionists, administrative assistants, door attendants, store greeters, and so forth. These are the people themselves who told him, look, this is part of an interview he was doing. And then the second one are what he calls the goons, those who act to harm or deceive others on behalf of their employer, or to lawyers, he refers to them as lawyers, marketeers, public relations specialists, and so forth. Yeah. And then the third one are the duct tapers, those who temporarily fix problems that could be fixed permanently. Example, programmers repairing shoddy code, airline desk staff who calm passengers whose bags do not arrive, and so forth. And then the fourth are the box tickers, who create the appearance that something useful is being done when it is not. Example, survey administrators, in-house magazine journalists, corporate compliance officers. I hope you're not one of those. Yeah. And then the last is taskmasters, those who create extra work for those who do not need it. Example, middle management, leadership professionals. So some of us are guilty of those. And then he said that as a result of the neoliberalization of institutions like universities and corporations as well, and governments, they create these bullshit jobs. He calls them bullshit jobs, whose role is not so much to sustain benefits for society, but rather for those individuals in power. And he argues that even if you take away some of those jobs, they look powerful, they look important, it doesn't make any difference. In fact, things may get better, and so forth. So that the big boss, when the person goes on a tour, there has to be an entourage who do different things that will give the person a lot of power and prestige. If the person, let's say the minister, walks to a meeting overseas on his or her own, that is very demeaning. Yeah. They need an entourage of 20 people from, civil service, private sector, and so forth. And so, so he says that this is, part of the process of bullshit jobs that he was talking about. Now, and then he talks about the term managerial feudalism, where the jobs which are given has to do with power, creating a power structure, so that not only people feel important, but also as a means of how they can extend their control over somebody else. Now, and I told you about the poll in the United States, in the UK, but 37% of the Britons who surveyed says that yes, indeed, they have jobs which are either bullshit, and then another 13% said yes, maybe it's bullshit, which is about 50%. That's quite a large number. Now, He also talked to academics about the value of their work, and some of them would say, yes, I go to work sometimes, and I'm not really sure what I'm doing there. My very first job was to be a postal boy. I was in high school, and then I had a holiday job in the central postal office in Suva, in Fiji. The first week was very enthusiastic. I would take mails around the city and even to the big ships coming in. Then after 1 week, I began to think, hang on, why am I doing all this? What is all this? And I started thinking about maybe if I study harder and stop doing this useless thing that I'm doing every day. When I was working at the University of Australian National University in Australia, some of us would have beers every Friday, and we would talk about the value of what we were doing, because we would be contracted by the government to do certain things, and then we would conclude as the beer starts, the molecule starts to come in contact with the molecules of the brain, and then we start talking about all the bullshit jobs we've been doing, and so forth. So yes, somewhere, sometimes, according to David Graeber, we start to rethink and question when you're driving to work, after work, about the value. Some of you have retired. What have I been doing all these years? Yes, it was enjoyable, but when you think deeply, probably some of those questions about the value to society, your impact to society, comes in as well. Now, I'm quickly running out of time, so I better hurry up. I'm trying to cut corners here. Now that brings us to the last bit, which is to do with academic, what has been referred to as academic bullshit. Now, Eubanks and Scuffer, they talk about academic bullshit. Way back in 2008. And the way in which beautiful rhetoric and amazing discourses are used to cover up the fact that some of those ideas actually are vacuous, have no social value whatsoever. It is the value of the, according to them, it's the value of the narrative, it's the value of the discourse, which is sellable. Now, and according to them, the rise of the bullshit in the political life, in fact, very much parallels the rise of academic bullshit as well. And one of the central focus of academic bullshit, according to them, is to do with how dazzling it is in terms of mesmerizing people through the sophistication of the arguments. And they mentioned things like in conferences, in big speeches, like I'm doing now, and so forth. That's where academics try to capture the imagination of people. And it's not so much the truth they're talking about, it's the way they deliver. It's to do with the way in which they try to be convincing. Now, so another bullshitologist, Thomas Santo, talked about, he came up with the term epistemically exploitative bullshit. In other words, something epistemic has to do with knowledge, anyway. And then he argues that speakers who are engaged and thinkers who are engaged in deception, and how intellectuals can exploit people's thinking through the show of lovely words, an expression of lovely words, manifestation of lovely words and lovely ideas, which they refer to as a form of injustice in a way, because it mesmerizes people, but it really don't give any value to them in terms of knowledge, just the beautiful words. So the language of academia can also be used to hide a lot of dishonest practices and the falsification of data that has happened over the years. In fact, in my forthcoming book on the crisis of global knowledge, part of, I'll be talking about a lot of these things. There's a chapter on bullshit knowledge, drawing on some of the theories of bullshitology. I have a list of something like 100 so far and going, 120 of academics in the world who have been caught out for fraud purposes, fraudulent practices. Let me just, as an example, just to quickly give you, my papers are everywhere. I'll give you a list of just some examples. I've removed the names, but I kept the university names there because they're very prestigious universities. Such and such, a cardiologist, Harvard University, fabricated data in published research articles, more than 100 abstracts and book chapters. That's a lot. Yeah. So the person was disbarred for 10 years and so forth, by the US National Institute for Health and so forth. And another one was the director of a heart research center at the University of Connecticut, and guilty of 145 counts of fabrication and so forth. And also scientists fabricated data, about 183 scientific papers and so forth, and the list goes on and on and on. And one of the reasons for that is not because they want to deliberately mislead the readers, not because they want to deliberately mislead society because of the falsification of data, or simply because, to go back to Frankfurt, they have a purpose in mind. They want promotion, they want status, they want honor, and they want to be recognized. And that was the main reason. And also, to achieve those, the process of, I talk about the commodification of knowledge, and the pressure to publish, the pressure to engage in citation, the practice of citation, and so forth, to the extent that citation becomes a gaming exercise. The more citation, the better. So there's a lot of pressure on academics as a result of the metricization. Not so much the expansion of knowledge, but the metricization, commodification of the knowledge, that people are forced to do such things. Yeah. So the list is quite big. And even in a normal situation, those who are supposed to be honest academics, there's a lot of pressure on them, particularly in funding, for instance. If you want funding for your research, it's not so much the fact that you have to provide the most inspiring figures about what you want to do. It is the beauty of the narrative. It is how persuasive your narrative is, so that you can sell to the funders. With your science project, it's not the beauty of the methodology, it's not the beauty of the formula. It is the beauty of the narrative around it, so that you can sell it. Yeah. And that has become part of the way in which not just universities, corporations, you have to sell a product. The product can be a physical product. The product can be an intellectual product, can be a cultural product. It is the power of narrative. Or, according to Frankfurt, and also according to Spicer, it is the power of bullshit which makes it sell. Yeah. So, what about the future? Oh, hang on. I was supposed to be doing this, but I have failed to do that. The making of Bullshitology. I have passed that. Now, Now the future actually looks quite bright. Now, and the reason is that since Frankfurt used the word bullshit as an academic discourse, it has broken that, if you like, that sacred circle of respectability, that you can hide things, that you can use words to cover up certain things you don't want people to hear, that he just call it what it is. It's bullshit anyway. And the use of bullshit is quite diverse as well. It's used to refer to something that you don't like. It's used to refer to something which is nebulous. It's used to refer to something which doesn't make sense to you and you don't understand. It's used to refer to something which you know is probably false. So it's quite fluid in its usage. Although Frankfurt and some of those scholars use the term in a very specific ways to refer to institutions, to refer to particular forms of thinking. Now, what we're going to see in the future will be quite interesting because according to Davis, I mentioned Davis earlier, that bullshit is so pervasive, it's everywhere, that you cannot get away from it. You will only increase. In fact, the more it increases, the more it stimulates our imagination to be able to deal with those and begin to categorize them in ways which we've never done before. So it's no longer a sacred term that you only use in private, that you only use when you're gossiping about somebody. It is out there in public. So, and the fact that bullshit is nothing negative, it's no longer seen as something negative, but rather something which is useful. People have used it for useful purposes, has served humanity quite well in terms of how narratives have become a means by which people can achieve some of their personal goals and institutional goals. Now, according to Spicer, one of the reasons why bullshit will also begin to expand is because of three things that he talked about. One is what he refers to as the conceptual entrepreneurs. The conceptual entrepreneurs these are the professional bullshitters. The people who are paid to bullshit, whether it's to do with PR, whether it's to do with those who make things look good to project to the world. If you become a politician, you have a group of people around you, a minister or president, for instance, who will make you look good. He refers to them as an army of bullshitters who try to make you make the impression and the words look good. And then he also refers to what he refers to as the noisy ignorance. In other words, because of the demand for people to create narratives, to sell images, there's a disconnect between that and the fact that not many people are knowledgeable because of the way in which the knowledge system is now structured. Our knowledge of things are being reduced because everything is being driven by algorithms. You go onto the internet, then you Google, then this is it. So half of what you come across, in fact more than half, are probably not true. It's just there floating around. Some people put things in there. And so the real knowledgeable people are no longer around. So people are forced to come up with narratives which he refers to as noisy and ignorant. And then he also referred to the term permissive uncertainty. In other words, the way the world has evolved and the way in which algorithms online and so forth, they're actually designed for you to believe. Because there's no time to think. Everything is presented to you. So in other words, we have developed a permissive uncertainty psychology where we believe anything which comes. And sometimes we don't have time to think about, we're rushing to work, we're jumping from one, from a website to another, and everything is done in speed. We have no time to think and reason out. And so we tend to believe anything which comes. And also, truth is negotiable. And then, and the fact that bullshit is also negotiable, to the extent that I suppose the future we'll begin to see different configurations of truths, different configurations of bullshit emerging. Now, and also what we'll probably see, and we're seeing now, is the way in which something along the lines of the claims and counterclaims, the conspiracy theories and the counter-conspiracy theories. In the last few years, when you accuse people of conspiracy, they will say, you're the one who's conspiracy theory and so forth. Like, Trump was accused of fake news. He said, no, you're the fake news and so forth. We're going to see more of that bullshit versus bullshit contestation. In other words, whose bullshit is better than the other, and whose truth versus of truth is better than the other. Now, so in some ways, all those bullshitologists, I must say, all argue that bullshit has actually served humanity very well over the years, to the extent that it may not just disappear, because it's no longer seen as something which is morally bad. It's not seen as something which is behaviorally an anomaly. It's not seen as something which is to be scared of, something that we have to frown at, something that we have to dismiss as being unethical, but something which has a purpose, something which can be a strategy for framing the way we see the world. And a lot of them seem to argue that yes, bullshit can be vacuous, but also serves a particular purpose for particular people. Now, and also, in the last few years as well, we've seen people who argue that as people become more conscious of the bullshit around them, we're going to see more and more criticism and critical analysis of ideas to make sure that you're able to separate what is supposed to be bullshit and what is not. Now, I will end there. And basically, what I've tried to do was to give you just an overview of the way in which this thing called bullshitology has evolved, and the way in which it has expressed itself through academia and through other means over the years. So we have a few minutes for questions, and Bronwyn will be facilitating the question time.
We have a couple of runners, but we've got time for maybe just a couple of questions. And yes, you have heard the Provost Chancellor of the University of Canterbury give a lecture on bullshit. So maybe quick questions.
How would you suggest to lead our decolonization into a healthy way without falling into the prey of this? I heard that in Africa, when they want to decolonize science, and advocate some black magic, saying that it can lighten something far like a fire. And if science can be decolonized, how about democracy? How about humanity? How about freedom of speech? What's the line of decolonization?
Well, thank you so much for that. Yeah, of course, over the last few years, what we've seen is the rise of the decolonizing discourse in terms of ideas and in terms of behavior in institutions and systems as well. And a lot of the decolonizing thinking has to do with how do we take away the colonial narrative, for instance, and see what's beneath it, for instance. And one of the dominant theories of colonization has to do with the stratification of humanity. There's certain groups of people supposed to be superior intellectually and culturally than others. And over the years, decolonizing theorists, whether in anthropology and indigenous studies begin to unpack and see, hang on, there are alternative explanations to the way in which the colonial narrative has evolved over the years. So, yes, so the decolonizing narrative has to do with the way in which we unpack some of the dominant ideas and see whether those dominant ideas actually represent the truth that we think should be historically and culturally, and whether there are explanations which provide the alternative narrative, which are much closer to the truth than the colonial narrative. Yeah.
We've got one more quick question.
Thanks for the very enjoyable lecture. There was something occurred to me when you were speaking anyway. I don't know if you're familiar with Anthony Blinken, who was in the country recently.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, because I think there was a quote from him where he said something like, when he was talking about the Ukraine war at the White House press briefing, he said, I'm more interested in the truth than I am interested in the facts. Well, that was a very good version of like geopolitical bullshit. So my question really was in that area, do you think that bullshit is becoming an existential threat as it portrays geopolitics?
Yes, according to Spicer, yes. Because layers and layers of bullshit in geopolitics. The American geopolitical narrative of the world is full of them. Because if you want to do something, you have to, as Noam Chomsky said, you have to cover up a lot of stuff that you do, justify it so that it's accepted by others. And that's fundamental to politics anyway. And the Americans have been masters of that. And, the presidents and those who speak on behalf of the state in the United States. So, in other words, what happens is those layers of, if you like, falsification of reality become truth in themselves. And that becomes an existential threat to understanding the realities on the ground. At the time of the Iraq War, that was probably one of the biggest times when the truth became one of the biggest victims. All the news media, not only in the United States, all around the world, they have to toe the line. There were people who lost their jobs in the US because they said, hang on, what are we doing in Iraq? There's no weapons of mass destruction over there. Until when it was revealed that there was no weapons of mass destruction. And then people look at each other, they start blaming each other. I said, so there was shame. So yes, it was one of the biggest shameful periods of human intelligence, because we allowed our intelligence to be taken over by bullshit in a way which never happened before. The media, the academic institutions, the total, almost every aspect of the global thinking apparatus was taken over by that little piece of, let's say, bullshit. And then we're all embarrassed by the fact that it was just constructed to serve a particular purpose and had no bearing whatsoever on reality. So it's just one example of the many examples. And we're going to see, in fact, there are many examples like Blinken, for instance, where the narratives to achieve a particular geopolitical end will nullify the existence of truth. And so, yes, it becomes a threat to our intelligence, becomes a threat to our sense of humanity as individuals and as groups.
Well, on that note, can you join me in thanking Stephen Graeber for a very provocative lecture? Because at one level, yes, it's night, but at another level, we're entering an extremely difficult period, which is a huge challenge for academics. meaningful and democracy. So can you join me in thanking Steve very much?
It's all for bullshit.